Cops plant evidence on a black woman, shocked when the CIA chief stands up for her. They thought they'd get away with it. Two crooked cops, a routine traffic stop, and a hidden bag of narcotics they planted so a defenseless black woman would take the fall. But they didn't count on the resilience of a community that refused to remain silent. They didn't expect a top CIA official, haunted by past debts and determined to right old wrongs, to risk everything for justice. Beneath the surface of one small American town, conspiracy and prejudice festered for years, quietly controlling people's lives. Little did these officers know that on this day, their tangled web of racism and corruption would finally unravel. Elena Davies was not the kind of woman who sought the spotlight. She was 27 years old and worked as a dedicated social worker in the city of Fairview, a small urban center with a population that was diverse on paper but deeply segregated in reality. Born and raised in Fairview's East Side, Elena had seen her share of injustice and strife. A year earlier, she'd even helped establish a local youth mentorship program in partnership with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, aiming to steer at-risk teens away from trouble. She wanted to be the hand that reached out, especially where no one else dared to help. Raised in a single-parent household, Elena learned resilience from her mother, Maria Davies, who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Watching her mother labor to provide and still find time to volunteer at the neighborhood church left a profound imprint on Elena's sense of duty. Growing up, Elena promised herself that she would also make a difference, no matter how small. Fairview's East Side had potential, kids with big dreams, families who tried to hold it all together, and a sense of neighborly love often overshadowed by crime reports and negative stereotypes. In her early 20s, Elena enrolled at the local community college to study sociology and psychology. Her professors recognized something special in her, a listening ear and a compassionate heart. After graduating, she joined the city's Department of Social Services. On any given day, Elena could be found driving her navy blue Toyota Camry through neglected neighborhoods, checking in on children who had been flagged for truancy or families struggling to put meals on the table. She fought for those who fell through the cracks. Yet, for all her good work, Elena was no stranger to microaggressions and outright racism. From suspicious stares at upscale grocery stores to being followed by security guards in shopping malls, she'd lived with the stigma of being a black woman in a society that still quietly clung to old prejudices. She handled each slight with dignified grace, focusing on the next family she could help, the next child she could inspire. But deep down, she sometimes wondered if all her efforts could truly make a lasting change. As she took on more cases at social services, Elena became a familiar face among the East Side community. Many residents affectionately called her Miss Elena, a sign of respect and gratitude. Parents would greet her at the door with warm smiles because they knew she wasn't there to judge or pry, but to offer solutions and resources. Oftentimes, Elena used her own modest funds to purchase school supplies or winter coats for children in need. Her heart was big, but her wallet was not. Still, she believed every small act counted. There was one other thing that defined Elena, her unwavering faith. She wasn't the type to stand on street corners quoting scripture, but she had grown up at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where her mother still sang in the choir. Sunday mornings were sacred to Elena, a time to recharge her spiritual batteries and reflect on her path. Church was also where she received the earliest signs that leadership came naturally to her. She had organized youth volunteer days, Sunday school, and toy drives. On a deeper level, Elena credited her faith for helping her navigate the subtle currents of racism that had always accompanied her life's journey. Her social work colleagues revered her tenacity. Her clients valued her empathy and the tireless hours she spent fighting bureaucratic red tape. And friends often teased that Elena's next step would be running for city council, a suggestion she always brushed off with a laugh. "I'm just doing my part," she'd say, believing politics to be a different game entirely, one perhaps too compromising for her direct brand of compassion. At home, Elena lived in a small, neatly furnished apartment in a 4-story brick building. She cherished her quiet evenings reading novels by the likes of Maya Angelou and Alice Walker or watching classic films. She'd also begun to dabble in painting, using watercolors to express emotions she couldn't quite put into words. Often her art depicted scenes of unity, silhouettes holding hands, faces of children smiling, nature blooming. She might never exhibit her paintings publicly, but they brought her solace. Then, in a span of seconds, everything changed. One ordinary evening, as she headed home from a staff meeting, her life would take a turn she could never have anticipated. A routine drive through Fairview's winding backstreets would catapult her into a nightmare, testing every ounce of her faith in justice, humanity, and most importantly, in herself. It was just past 8 o'clock on a muggy summer evening. The sky bled orange and pink as dusk slowly settled. Tonight, Elena had taken a detour to avoid congested main roads. She was thinking about the presentation she had given earlier that day, proposing more robust intervention programs for teenagers on probation. The meeting had gone well, and Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. Little did she suspect her entire life was about to be derailed. Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights cut through the twilight, accompanied by a short, piercing wail of a police siren. Elena glanced at her speedometer. She was well within the limit. Confused but compliant, she pulled over to the shoulder. A swirl of apprehension stirred in her stomach as she watched through the rearview mirror. 2 officers emerged from the cruiser. She noticed the distinct outlines of their uniforms in her side mirror and braced herself, rolling down her window as they approached. "License and registration," the taller officer barked. His name tag read Officer Victor Morgan. His partner, a stockier man with a buzz cut, hovered just behind him. On his uniform, the name Officer Paul Gibson was visible. Elena calmly complied. "Good evening, officers. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Her voice was polite, but carried a noticeable tremor. Officer Morgan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her license and registration, flipping them as though searching for something to be amiss. "Your taillight's busted," he finally said. Elena frowned. She was pretty sure both taillights were fine. She'd recently checked. However, she knew better than to argue outright. "I wasn't aware," she said, forcing politeness. "I'll get that looked at right away." Morgan gave a dismissive snort. Gibson walked to the back of her car, shining a flashlight on the taillights. Elena saw him press his hand against one of them, as if testing it. Then he returned, whispering something to Morgan. Elena couldn't make out the words, but she could sense tension in the air. "Step out of the vehicle," Morgan ordered. The edge in his voice pricked at Elena's nerves. She felt her heart rate spike. She'd been stopped before for minor traffic checks, expired tags, a missing front license plate, but never had she been told to step out of the vehicle for something as trivial as a busted tail light. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elena asked quietly. Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Are you resisting a lawful order?" "No, sir," Elena said hastily, unbuckling her seat belt. She'd been taught since childhood to avoid giving any reason for escalation. Her mind flashed to news stories, tragedies she couldn't bear to think about. With trembling hands, she opened her car door and stepped onto the curb. The summer air felt suddenly oppressive. A wave of anxiety clung to her like a second skin. She watched as Gibson ducked into the driver's side, rummaging around. Fear gripped her chest. She knew she had nothing illegal in her car. She barely had time to pick up groceries most days, let alone contraband. Yet here she was, witnessing a search that felt deeply invasive. She wanted to protest, but froze under Morgan's stern gaze. The officer practically loomed over her. Minutes ticked by in agonizing slowness. Gibson emerged, brandishing a small plastic bag filled with a white powdery substance. His eyes lit with feigned triumph as he held it up. "Found this under the driver's seat." Elena's eyes went wide. "That's not mine," she gasped, her voice cracked with equal parts fear and outrage. "I've never seen that before in my life." Morgan smirked and exchanged a look with Gibson. "Sure you haven't," he said, mocking disbelief. "Drug possession, possibly distribution. You're under arrest." Everything happened in a blur. Elena's arms were yanked behind her back, cold metal cuffs binding her wrists. Panic seized her entire body. She tried to tell them, tried to insist she was innocent, but the officers moved with rehearsed efficiency, ignoring her pleas. Gibson read her Miranda rights in a droning monotone, as though he'd done it 1,000 times. In the swirling chaos, Elena caught a glimpse of Morgan's face. There was a cold glint in his eyes, something akin to triumph. She realized with sinking clarity that this was no honest mistake. They were targeting her. Why her? Was it because she was a black woman alone on a dark road? Her heart thundered as she was shoved into the back of the police cruiser. The world outside blurred. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. Her job, her reputation, her mother's heartbreak upon hearing this. her kids at the mentorship program who trusted her. She breathed in short, ragged bursts, tears stinging her eyes as the car pulled away. Elena wondered if this was the end of all she'd worked for. An arrest of this nature could ruin her career, snuff out her reputation in the community, and tear her life apart. She thought of her mother's proud smile whenever Elena spoke about her job. She thought of the kids who looked up to her. She thought of the glaring injustice, and she prayed that somehow, someway, the truth would come to light. They booked her that same night. The fluorescent lights of the Fairview police station cast everything in a stark, unforgiving glow. Elena found herself standing for a mug shot, tears she tried to hold back streaming down her cheeks. Her hair, usually styled neatly in box braids, now fell across her face in a disarray that matched her inner turmoil. As Elena shuffled along in handcuffs, she overheard snide whispers from a couple of officers behind the booking desk. She caught phrases like, "just another dealer," and "she'll be in and out." Each word felt like a stab to her chest, a condemnation based on nothing more than stereotypes and the crooked evidence planted on her. She felt anger and dread swirl inside her, colliding in a tidal wave of raw emotion. Once processed, Elena was led to a small interrogation room. A single flickering light overhead hummed obnoxiously. The room smelled of cheap disinfectant. Officer Morgan was there, leaning against a table, arms folded. His partner, Gibson, hovered near the door. Elena felt trapped, as if any movement could provoke them. Her voice wavered as she attempted to speak. "I want a lawyer." Morgan shrugged. "Sure, you'll get one. Public defender, maybe. You think that'll help?" Elena's lips quivered. "I haven't done anything wrong," she insisted. "That's not my." "Save it." Morgan cut her off, slamming a folder onto the table. "You fit the profile, Davies. We find drugs in your car, end of story." He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is your rap sheet now." Elena's stomach churned at his words. She had no prior arrests, no record, yet here he was, speaking as if she were a known criminal. "This is a mistake," she whispered, tears threatening again. Officer Gibson, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "You had a choice, you know. Could have walked the straight and narrow like the rest of us. But you scum never learn." Elena felt searing rage, but also a glimmer of defiance. "I work for social services," she spat. "I help people. I mentor kids. I've never touched drugs in my life." Morgan snickered. "Sure you do, sweetheart. You can save that story for the judge." They left her in that barren interrogation room for what felt like an eternity. Elena sat alone, hands trembling. There was a metal chair and a table, both cold to the touch. She placed her head in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of her mother, probably at home waiting for a phone call that Elena had promised but never made. She wondered if she'd be allowed to call her mother soon. Panic threatened to consume her at the thought of a long, hopeless night in a holding cell. Eventually, a different officer, a younger woman named Officer Riley, entered and led Elena out of the interrogation room. Riley, with kind eyes and a hesitant demeanor, walked Elena through the labyrinth of halls until they reached a holding cell. The young officer muttered an apology under her breath, as if she too sensed something amiss. Elena briefly locked eyes with Riley, silently pleading for help, but the officer lowered her gaze as if powerless against the system she served. The cell was cramped and dingy. The walls were lined with chipped paint, for other women occupied it, each wearing expressions of despair and anger. Elena found a corner and sank to the cold concrete floor, hugging her knees. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against them, and prayed again for truth, for justice, for an end to this nightmare. An hour later, an officer called her name. Elena looked up to see a public defender had arrived, a tired-looking man with rumpled clothes named Arthur Ramirez. He offered a tight-lipped smile as soon as he approached the cell. Elena pleaded her case in halting words, explaining that the drugs in her car were planted. She tried to detail her background, her job, her entire life's work. Ramirez listened, nodding with mild sympathy, but Elena could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He probably had 100 other clients claiming their innocence. "Look," Ramirez said softly, once they were seated in a small consultation room. "We'll request bail in the morning. For now, hang in there. I'll see what I can do." Elena stared at him, searching for reassurance. "Please, I can't lose my job. The kids. My mother." Ramirez sighed. "I understand. I'll do my best. But this is a serious charge, Elena." Possession with intent to distribute. The amount they found. Let's just say the prosecution won't go easy. For a moment, Elena was at a loss for words. Then the raw frustration broke through. They planted it. She repeated, every syllable trembling with conviction. I swear to you. Ramirez nodded again. We'll investigate. That's all I can promise. He hurriedly scribbled some notes on his pad. In the meantime, keep your head down. Don't say anything to anyone. Night settled in. Elena sat in the cell, which seemed to shrink around her. She closed her eyes and drifted in and out of fitful sleep, waking to nightmares of cage doors slamming and Officer Morgan's cold smirk. Yet even then, she clung to hope, because if she let go of hope, she might never find her way out of the darkness. By dawn, word had already spread. News travels fast in Fairview, especially when it's about someone as well known and respected as Elena Davies. Her mother, Maria, was the first to arrive at the police station, her face etched with worry and confusion. She had received a call from Elena's phone the night before, a terse message informing her that Elena was in custody. No details, just the devastating news. Maria clutched her handbag, knuckles white, as she demanded to speak to someone, anyone who could explain what was happening to her daughter. The officer at the front desk, apathetic and stone-faced, merely told her to wait. Maria sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs for hours, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Her prayers whispered softly. Lord, please protect my baby. She's innocent. I know she is. By mid-morning, Elena's friends from social services got wind of the arrest. Her closest colleague, Mariana Castro, canceled all her meetings and rushed to the station. Soon, others from the community poured in. Youth Elena had mentored, parents who knew and admired her, a few church members from Mount Olive Baptist. They gathered on the sidewalk outside the station, hushed in disbelief. Some tried to console Maria, while others strategized about what to do next. Inside the holding cell, Elena finally had a chance to speak with her mother for a few minutes, courtesy of a visiting window and phone line. The moment Maria saw her daughter in a jumpsuit, tears filled her eyes. Elena, baby, what happened? Maria's voice cracked, trembling with every syllable. She pressed her palm against the thick plexiglass as if hoping to reach through. They planted it on me, Mama, Elena said, her own eyes brimming with tears she tried to suppress. She needed to appear strong for her mother's sake. I swear, I have no idea where those drugs came from. You have to believe me. Maria's voice steadied, adopting the same comforting tone she'd used when Elena was a child. I believe you, Elena. We'll get you out of here. We'll fight this. Shortly after that, Elena was led back to her cell. The next few hours were a blur. Paperwork, processing, the scrawl of official documents. Her bail hearing was scheduled for later in the day. The fact that she had a stable job and roots in the community might work in her favor, or so Ramirez had indicated. Meanwhile, outside, Mariana and a small group of Elena's supporters decided to take action. They carried signs hastily made with cardboard and markers, "Free Elena Davies" and "Justice for Elena." A few had gone a step further, referencing the broader injustices they had witnessed in Fairview's policing. "Racial profiling is real" was printed in bold letters on one sign. Local reporters from the Fairview Tribune arrived, sniffing a story about potential police misconduct. They had covered Elena in positive community spotlights before, highlighting her mentorship program and her tireless advocacy. To see her mugshot now posted on the local news website under the headline, "Social Worker Arrested on Drug Charges," sparked outrage and confusion. A seasoned journalist named Gregory Shaw stepped forward, notepad in hand, wanting answers. Mariana told Shaw, "Anyone who knows Elena knows this is bogus. She's the last person to be involved in drugs." She pointed at the station. "But we've heard stories about these cops, about how they target certain neighborhoods, certain people." Gregory Shaw scribbled notes rapidly. "Any evidence to back that up?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more sympathetic than cynical. Mariana hesitated. "Not yet, but you'll see. Elena's innocent. The cops are the ones who should be investigated." The small protest outside the station began to grow. Fairview's East Side community, long suspicious of police tactics, found a rallying point in Elena's case. Parents whose teens had been stopped multiple times for minor infractions, or for no reason at all, joined the crowd. Anger and frustration simmered. The police tried to dismiss them, claiming this was an isolated incident, but the community wasn't convinced. Inside the building, Maria clung to Mariana's arm as they waited in a corridor outside the bail hearing room. The door finally opened, and Elena, escorted by an officer, was led inside. Officer Morgan and Officer Gibson were also present, conferring with a stern-looking prosecutor. The moment Elena and her mother locked eyes, Maria mouthed, "We'll get through this." Elena nodded, heart pounding. At the bail hearing, Ramirez outlined Elena's contributions to the community and her lack of prior criminal history. He insisted there was a strong possibility the narcotics were not hers. The prosecutor, however, painted Elena as a possible secret trafficker, referencing the quantity of drugs found. Elena's gut clenched. She wanted to scream the truth. Ultimately, the judge ruled Elena was not a flight risk. He set bail, albeit at a steep amount. Maria and Mariana immediately started making phone calls, pooling resources, and within a few hours, they managed to secure the bail money, thanks to a fundraiser from the church and Elena's extended network of supporters. That evening, Elena walked out of the police station, feeling the scorching gaze of Morgan and Gibson burning into her back. The community members outside erupted in cheers and relief. Elena took a deep breath of the fresh air, tears in her eyes, as she embraced her mother, then Mariana. The emotional moment was captured by local reporters who had gathered. The glaring injustice fueled the headlines. A respected social worker, beloved in her community, charged with a crime that seemed to defy logic. Yet Elena knew this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over. The system seemed stacked against her, and if the cops were willing to plant evidence, how far would they go to protect their lie? Elena feared the worst, but vowed to stand strong, no matter the cost. Across the country in Langley, Virginia, at the CIA headquarters, Director Richard Patterson was at his desk, flipping through intelligence briefings about foreign threats and national security issues. He was a man used to dealing with high-stakes matters involving global espionage and terrorist threats. But that morning, he received a personal call, one that rattled him more than any piece of classified intel could. The call was from an old friend, David Sullivan, a former Army buddy who had once saved Patterson's life during an overseas operation years ago. Back when Patterson was a field officer with the CIA on a clandestine mission, Sullivan, an intelligence liaison, had stepped in during an ambush, taking a bullet that was meant for Patterson. Ever since, the two men had maintained a close bond, each owing an unspoken debt to the other. Sullivan, who had long since retired and settled in Fairview, had caught wind of Elena Davies' situation. He knew Elena through community events and had admired her devotion to local youth. Outraged by her arrest, Sullivan dialed the only person he believed had the clout and moral compass to help, Richard Patterson. "Richard, I need a favor," Sullivan said, voice tense. "There's this young woman in my town, Elena Davies. She's been framed by dirty cops, I'm sure of it." Patterson frowned, tapping a pen on his desk. "Framed? That's a serious allegation." "She's a pillar of the community," Sullivan continued. "And I'm not the only one who thinks so. The entire East Side is rallying behind her. I want you to look into this. She can't get a fair shake otherwise." Patterson paused, glancing at the door to his office as if expecting someone to burst in. He ran the CIA, an agency not typically involved in domestic police matters. But a personal debt was a personal debt, and his friend's earnestness struck a chord. "I'll see what I can do," he finally said. A few hours later, Patterson found himself reviewing Elena's file, which was quickly compiled by some trusted analysts he'd asked to do a discreet background check. Everything about Elena's record supported Sullivan's claim. She was squeaky clean, an upstanding citizen. The police report, however, cast a suspiciously contradictory picture. Patterson's instincts, honed by years of sniffing out deception, sensed something off. He dialed another number, this time to an official contact within the Department of Justice. While the CIA seldom stepped into such territory, Patterson had cultivated a broad network of allies across federal agencies. If Elena Davies was truly being railroaded, he wanted the right people to know. Days later, Patterson boarded a plane to Fairview under the guise of a personal trip. Officially, he was on a short leave, an opportunity to visit an old friend. Unofficially, he was determined to see the truth with his own eyes. Sullivan met him at the small Fairview airport, driving him straight to a nondescript diner near the East Side. There, over black coffee and stale donuts, Patterson listened as Sullivan recounted Elena's arrest and the brewing community uproar. So, these cops, Morgan and Gibson, Sullivan said, leaning in. They've got a history. I've heard rumors about them shaking down local businesses, stopping people for no reason, especially people of color. But no one's ever been able to pin anything on them. They're protected by the higher-ups. Patterson drummed his fingers on the diner's chipped tabletop. It won't be easy. There's jurisdictional red tape. The CIA can't just intervene in a local case. But I can quietly provide some resources, ask a few federal contacts to dig around. Sullivan's eyes shone with relief. That's all I need, Richard. If there's dirt on these guys, it'll come to the surface. Elena can't fight them alone. She's a good kid. Patterson nodded. Let's meet her. Within days, whispers circulated around the Fairview Police Department that a high-ranking federal official was snooping around. The rumor mill churned with speculation. FBI? CIA? Department of Justice? Officers grew uneasy, especially those who had reason to fear scrutiny. And none felt that fear more acutely than Officer Morgan and Officer Gibson. Patterson, working quietly behind the scenes, had called in a favor from a Department of Justice contact, a senior investigator named Laura Mendez. Under normal circumstances, the DOJ might not prioritize a single case of alleged evidence planting, but Patterson had leverage. He hinted at undisclosed intelligence suggesting that the Fairview PD might be involved in broader civil rights abuses. That piqued Mendez's interest. Soon, Mendez arrived in Fairview with a small task force focused on possible police misconduct. Their presence at the police station sent shock waves through the ranks. They interviewed Elena multiple times, compiling any detail that might aid their case. Elena recounted the night of her arrest with unwavering consistency, describing Morgan and Gibson's every word, every gesture. Laura Mendez was moved by Elena's sincerity and frustration. While the DOJ team examined internal records, Patterson used his own resources to look into Morgan and Gibson's personal histories. He found suspicious bank deposits, flagged by financial watchdogs, but never investigated. He discovered a series of complaints filed against them. Excessive force, discriminatory conduct, all dismissed by the department's Internal Affairs Office, which was possibly compromised. A pattern of corruption began to emerge, each clue pointing to a system that protected Morgan and Gibson rather than reining them in. Mendez, methodical and unyielding, confronted the Fairview Police Chief, Andrew Cole, about these complaints and irregularities. Cole stonewalled, insisting his officers had been cleared of all allegations. "We have a thorough internal affairs process," he insisted, avoiding eye contact. But Mendez's unimpressed stare spoke volumes. She wasn't buying it. Outside the station, the community demonstrations continued, growing louder and more insistent. Protesters demanded Morgan and Gibson be suspended pending the investigation. Chants of justice for Elena rang through the streets. The tension in Fairview escalated, local news crews capturing every angle. Politicians in the city council tried to placate the public with carefully worded statements about transparency and maintaining trust in law enforcement. But Elena's supporters saw it as lip service. Elena herself oscillated between hope and fear. She still had her job, though she'd been placed on temporary leave until her legal situation was resolved. Waking up each morning felt like stepping onto a battlefield. She spent her days meeting with Ramirez, her public defender, who was now bolstered by the evidence Mendez's team had unearthed. The narrative that Elena was framed was gathering steam, but Elena knew that none of it would matter unless it held up in court. Meanwhile, Morgan and Gibson began feeling the heat. People whispered in the corridors about how the DOJ was digging up dirt. Morgan tried to maintain an air of superiority, scoffing at the notion that he would ever be caught. Gibson, however, grew jittery. He drank more coffee than usual, paced the halls, and snapped at colleagues. Deep down, he suspected that once investigators started peeling back the layers, they might find more than just Elena's case. They'd find a pattern of misconduct that could land them in serious trouble, or worse, behind bars. One afternoon, as Morgan and Gibson took a coffee break in a small diner near the station, they discussed the situation in hushed tones. Gibson's voice trembled with poorly disguised panic. "Victor, man, we got to watch our step. The feds are all over this." Morgan glared, sipping his coffee with forced calm. "Relax. We've been clean so far. They got nothing. Elena Davies is just another perp. She'll crack eventually." Gibson scratched his head, sweat beading on his brow. "But what if? What if someone talks? Morgan leaned in. No one will talk. We've done this before, right? Let the storm blow over. Still, there was an unspoken tension between them. Each was secretly wondering whether the other might become a liability. In a twisted system where self-preservation ruled, loyalty was tenuous at best. A few days later, Laura Mendez brought Elena in for another interview. She mentioned new developments, though she couldn't share all the details. We're compiling a case against Morgan and Gibson, Mendez said, offering a thin smile. They're under suspicion of multiple counts of misconduct. Elena's heart pounded with cautious relief. So you believe me? Mendez nodded. I do. But believing you and proving this in court are two different things. We need a decisive piece of evidence or testimony that directly ties them to planting those drugs. Elena's mind raced. I don't have that, she admitted, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. They were smart about how they did it. Mendez placed a reassuring hand on Elena's shoulder. We'll keep looking. Don't lose hope. Outside the office, Elena ran into Richard Patterson, who had come to quietly check on the progress. Thank you, Elena murmured. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you. Patterson's expression softened. I'm doing it because it's right, Elena. And because sometimes one person's fight for justice is all that's needed to shine a light on a much bigger problem. Little did anyone know, the biggest surprises were yet to come. The deeper Mendez, Patterson, and their allies dug, the more skeletons they unearthed. And somewhere in the swirling shadows of conspiracy and corruption, a damning secret was waiting to explode into the public eye. The trial date arrived sooner than Elena had expected, a flurry of paperwork, depositions, and sleepless nights leading up to the moment she'd face her accusers in open court. News vans lined the block outside the Fairview courthouse. People from both sides of the city's divide filed into the public gallery, eager to witness a trial that had captured the entire town's attention. Elena sat next to Ramirez at the defense table, her heart thumping in her chest. On the prosecution side was Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Lee, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and a near-obsessive focus on drug cases. Officer Morgan and Officer Gibson sat behind Lee, their faces schooled into masks of righteous indignation. Judge Rosalind Harper presided over the case, a stern figure who was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. As the proceedings began, ADA Lee painted Elena as a secret drug runner who used her position as a social worker to gain the trust of vulnerable individuals and distribute narcotics. Elena felt her stomach churn at the brazen distortions. She glanced at Ramirez, who squeezed her arm reassuringly. When Ramirez took the floor for opening statements, he spoke passionately of Elena's record, her standing in the community, and the suspicious circumstances of her arrest. He openly suggested that the drugs were planted, drawing a low murmur from the gallery. Morgan and Gibson exchanged a glance, their postures rigid, as though Ramirez's words were arrows aimed at their guilt. One by one, prosecution witnesses were called. Most were other officers or lab technicians who had tested the drugs. They presented chain of custody documents and photos of the supposed discovery in Elena's car. To the casual observer, it seemed airtight, except Ramirez kept poking holes in the timeline, the handling of evidence, and the lack of body cam footage from either Morgan or Gibson. Indeed, both officers claimed their body cams had malfunctioned that night, a glaring irregularity that left the jury uneasy. Then came Elena's turn on the stand. Ramirez carefully guided her through the events of that evening. Her voice, trembling at first, grew stronger as she told her truth. She recounted every detail. The moment the lights flashed behind her, the order to step out of the car, the bag of drugs magically appearing. She shared her background, her career, and her unblemished record, painting a portrait of a committed community servant rather than a cunning criminal. Lee's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to corner Elena, suggesting she had debts or a hidden lifestyle that made drug dealing lucrative. Elena remained composed, denying each insinuation. When Lee pressed further, citing text messages to a client, Elena explained it was about a teenage boy who needed help getting into a rehabilitation program for mental health. No illegal dealings whatsoever. Frustrated, Lee eventually relented, but not before planting seeds of doubt in some jury members' minds. Outside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Community members held signs, chanting support for Elena. Others, skeptical or swayed by the spectacle of the trial, muttered that where there's smoke, there's fire. The media seized on the story, polarizing public opinion. Was Elena a victim or a criminal mastermind? Midway through the trial, Laura Mendez made a crucial discovery. She found a former police officer named Joseph Edwards, who had served with Morgan and Gibson years ago, but quit under mysterious circumstances. Edwards admitted in a sworn statement that he had witnessed Morgan planting evidence in another case, though he had been too fearful to come forward. Threats of retaliation and blacklisting had kept him silent. Now, with the DOJ involved, Edwards decided to speak up. When Edwards took the stand, the courtroom erupted. He described how Morgan had bragged about cleaning up the streets by teaching these gangbangers and punks a lesson. Edwards saw a pattern. Morgan would pull over a suspect for a minor violation, then discover drugs hidden in the vehicle. The details matched Elena's case to a chilling degree. Morgan's face turned crimson during Edwards' testimony, and he interrupted more than once, prompting Judge Harper to warn him about contempt of court. Gibson slouched lower in his seat, darting furtive looks between Morgan and the jury. As Edwards finished, Ramirez's line of questioning hammered home the parallels to Elena's arrest. Now the prosecution scrambled. Their star witnesses, Morgan and Gibson, were scheduled to testify next. In a strategic move, ADA Lee tried to paint Edwards as a disgruntled ex-cop with a vendetta, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had taken root, blossoming into outright suspicion of Morgan's motives. When court adjourned that day, Elena walked out with her shoulders a bit straighter, a small ray of hope dancing in her eyes. The momentum had shifted. She could sense the jury's skepticism toward the officer's stories. A hush had fallen over the onlookers. The possibility of Elena's innocence seemed more real than ever. But Elena also knew the trial wasn't over. As she left the building, she spotted Morgan and Gibson scowling from a distance, and she felt a chill. This was a battle not just for her freedom, but for her life. People who were cornered could lash out in dangerous ways. She tried to push the fear aside, focusing instead on the progress they'd made. For the first time since her nightmare began, Elena believed she might have a chance to reclaim her future. Days turned into a blur of tense courtroom sessions and heated debates. Outside the courthouse, camera crews vied for vantage points, capturing every significant development for the evening news. Inside, Elena's supporters filled the seats, praying silently, believing justice might finally prevail. Then came an explosive moment no one saw coming. On the morning of a key witness's testimony, an internal affairs officer named Daniel Foster, who had previously dismissed complaints against Morgan and Gibson, arrived at court visibly shaken. As soon as the session commenced, he approached ADA Lee and whispered something. Lee's eyes widened, and a ripple of shock passed through the prosecution team. Moments later, Lee addressed the judge and requested a brief recess to confer with his client. A flurry of speculation circulated through the courtroom. Elena clutched Ramirez's arm. "What's going on?" she whispered. "I'm not sure," Ramirez answered, watching with hawk-like intensity. "Something big, it seems." When the session reconvened, Lee stood up, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, Officer Gibson has informed the state that he wishes to modify his testimony at this." Morgan shot up, eyes blazing. He hissed Gibson's name, but Gibson stared at the floor, refusing to meet his partner's gaze. The judge nodded cautiously. "Proceed, Mr. Lee." Gibson was called back to the stand. His face was pale, his hands trembling. The gallery leaned forward in hushed anticipation. Gibson began, his voice quavering. "I need to correct parts of my previous testimony. The drugs found in Miss Davies's car. They were not hers." A gasp swept through the room. Elena's heart leapt into her throat. She locked eyes with Ramirez, whose expression mirrored her astonishment. Judge Harper rapped her gavel lightly. "Order. Let's have some decorum." Gibson struggled on. "Morgan told me to say I saw Miss Davies hide something under her seat. That's not true. I never saw her do anything. In fact, He swallowed hard, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "I saw Morgan place the bag of drugs himself. I tried to stop him, but he threatened me. I was scared. I went along with it." The courtroom erupted. Morgan lunged to his feet, face livid, and snarled at Gibson. "You lying son of a." Before he could finish, Judge Harper hammered her gavel, demanding silence. Court officers rushed to restrain Morgan, who pounded the rail in front of him, veins bulging in his neck. Elena felt her entire body tremble with a mixture of relief, shock, and residual fear. Gibson's confession was the final blow to the prosecution's case. Ramirez exhaled as though finally releasing a breath he'd held for weeks. Mariana, seated in the gallery beside Maria, clutched Maria's hand, tears of joy coursing down both their faces. When order was restored, Judge Harper asked Gibson to elaborate. He spilled details that corroborated Elena's account, describing how Morgan orchestrated the traffic stop to teach a lesson and how he'd boasted about saving the city from drug dealers. Gibson admitted that Elena had done nothing suspicious to warrant the search and that he'd watched Morgan plant the narcotics under her seat. Fear of retaliation and loyalty to his partner had kept him silent until now. Assistant DA Lee looked as though he'd swallowed a lemon. With the star witness recanting, the state's case collapsed in on itself. Lee had no choice but to request a recess to confer with his superiors. Meanwhile, Laura Mendez and her DOJ colleagues quietly congratulated Ramirez, indicating they would be pressing charges against Morgan for civil rights violations and conspiracy. News of Gibson's confession spread like wildfire through Fairview's halls of justice. Outside, the press exploded with questions for Elena. Microphones and cameras were shoved toward her. She took a moment to compose herself before speaking. "I am grateful the truth came out," she said, voice trembling yet resolute. "I've always believed in justice, and I hope this moment can be a step forward, not just for me, but for everyone who's been wronged." In the swirl of euphoria, Elena caught sight of Morgan being escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs by internal affairs officers. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes still scanning for Gibson, presumably for some final venomous threat. Elena felt a chill at the reminder that though the truth prevailed, true accountability would require vigilance. As Elena left the courthouse that day, flanked by her mother and Mariana, Richard Patterson stood quietly off to the side. He gave her a supportive nod, as if to say, "Well done." Elena smiled back, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. She knew that people like Patterson, Sullivan, Mendez, even Gibson in his last-minute confession, had all played roles in unmasking the truth. Little did she know that the real reckoning for Morgan and others like him was only just beginning. For Elena, however, she finally saw a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. The fallout was swift and severe. In the days following Gibson's confession, the Fairview Police Department found itself under the microscope of a federal investigation. Laura Mendez's team uncovered a web of corruption that went deeper than anyone had imagined. Records tampering, falsified reports, excessive use of force. Morgan and Gibson weren't the only ones implicated. A handful of other officers also came under scrutiny, accused of participating in or covering up misconduct. News headlines blared. "Officer admits planting evidence. Department under siege." Community outcry surged. Protests turned into public demands for widespread reform. Police Chief Andrew Cole, once adamant that his department had no issues, faced mounting pressure to resign. Eventually, he announced his early retirement, citing personal reasons, but the public knew better. His abrupt exit was a symbol of the scandal that now gripped Fairview. Morgan, charged with multiple counts of perjury, tampering with evidence, and civil rights violations, was held without bail. During a hearing, prosecutors revealed they had tracked his financial transactions, revealing suspicious deposits tied to known drug dealers, suggesting Morgan had been running a side racket for profit. When confronted with these allegations, Morgan erupted in the courtroom, cursing the DOJ, Elena, and even Gibson. Judge Harper ordered him removed and held in contempt. His once confident swagger now looked like the flailing of a desperate man cornered by his own misdeeds. As for Gibson, he negotiated a plea deal with the DOJ, agreeing to testify against Morgan and other corrupt officers. He resigned from the force in disgrace, but his confession at least spared him the harshest penalties. Some in the community viewed Gibson's belated honesty with contempt, but others recognized it had been pivotal in freeing Elena. The day Elena's charges were officially dropped, she stood outside the courthouse beside her mother and Mariana, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. The city prosecutor's office issued a statement apologizing for the wrongful arrest, acknowledging grave misconduct in Elena's case. Cameras flashed, and reporters pressed close, asking Elena how she felt about the apology. "I appreciate that the truth has prevailed," Elena said, voice thick with emotion. I hope this is the start of real change, so no one else has to go through what I did." Community members enveloped Elena in hugs and cheers. Children from the mentorship program, some of them accompanied by parents, held up signs that read, "Welcome home, Miss Elena." She smiled, hugging them tightly. At that moment, the weight of the ordeal lifted, replaced by a sense of triumph and renewed purpose. The experience, harrowing as it was, had forged in her an even stronger resolve to fight for justice. But karma had yet another turn to take. A deeper investigation revealed that Morgan had been part of a broader circle of corrupt officers who helped local drug traffickers eliminate competition. The irony was thick. The same cop who vilified Elena as a drug dealer was himself facilitating narcotics on Fairview streets for personal gain. With Morgan's empire of lies collapsing, several other complicit individuals found themselves under federal indictments as well. When Elena returned to her apartment after that final court appearance, she paused in the doorway, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender air freshener. She felt an overwhelming gratitude to be home, free from the specter of prison. On the kitchen table, she found a card from her church members, filled with messages of support. The surge of love and relief made her weep softly. She realized that while karma had delivered a harsh blow to those who wronged her, her life had changed forever too. Richard Patterson came by that evening, accompanied by David Sullivan. They brought a bouquet of flowers, daisies and sunflowers, and placed them on Elena's kitchen counter. Elena, offering them coffee, tried to convey her thanks, but words failed her. She finally managed to say, "I don't know how to repay you for what you did." Patterson shook his head. "No debt, Elena. We owed it to you, to the truth." Sullivan grinned. "I'm just glad I could call in a favor from the right person. You deserved better than what they did to you." In that moment, Elena felt a rush of relief and a renewed sense of confidence. Yes, she'd been victimized by corrupt cops, but she also saw the power of community and allyship in bringing about justice. She vowed that once she was fully recovered from this ordeal, she'd use her voice to advocate for reforms, ensuring others wouldn't fall into the same traps. Outside Elena's window, the summer sky turned a soft pink. The darkest chapter of her life was closing, but a new one was beginning, one in which she would stand stronger than ever, armed with the knowledge that truth and solidarity could triumph over even the most entrenched injustices. Life didn't snap back to normal for Elena overnight, but she began rebuilding her world piece by piece. The first step was returning to the Fairview Department of Social Services, where colleagues greeted her with applause and open arms. Her supervisor, relieved to see Elena exonerated, apologized for placing her on leave and granted her a well-deserved welcome-back reception. Elena's desk, which had been gathering dust, now overflowed with cards, flowers, and thank-you notes from families she'd helped over the years. Though she was free in the eyes of the law, Elena still wrestled with internal scars. Nights brought vivid nightmares of interrogation rooms and barred cells. On some evenings, she'd lie awake, heart pounding at every siren echoing through the streets. But therapy sessions, arranged through a local nonprofit offering free counseling to victims of systemic injustice, helped her cope. She also leaned on her church community, attending midweek prayer sessions and talking with her pastor, who reminded her that trauma could be transformed into testimony. As the months passed, Elena found herself drawn to advocacy. She accepted invitations to speak at community meetings, colleges, and legal forums, sharing her experience as a cautionary tale about systemic racism and police corruption. Her talks emphasized the importance of transparency in law enforcement. She spoke of Laura Mendez's diligent investigations and how crucial external oversight had been. Each time she spoke, Elena felt her confidence grow, her voice stronger. She was turning her ordeal into a powerful call for change. Meanwhile, the city government faced intense pressure to enact reforms. With the DOJ breathing down their neck, Fairview officials set up a citizen review board to oversee complaints against officers. Elena was invited to join as a community representative, an offer she accepted after careful consideration. "We need people with first-hand experience," said the city council member who extended the invitation. Elena agreed, hoping her presence would ensure no other innocent resident endured what she had. On weekends, Elena resumed her mentorship program. The kids who had seen her face on the news greeted her with cautious questions. "Were you really in jail, Miss Elena?" Or why did the cops do that? Elena answered them honestly, omitting the most traumatizing details, but sharing the lesson that sometimes authority figures could misuse power. Yet she always ended on a hopeful note, stressing the importance of standing up for what's right. Maria Davies, relieved to have her daughter home and safe, continued volunteering at Mount Olive Baptist Church. She watched Elena's transformation with a mixture of pride and sadness, pride in her daughter's resilience, sadness at the price she'd paid. Over Sunday dinners of fried chicken and collard greens, Maria often told Elena, "Baby, you turned your pain into purpose." I couldn't be prouder. Mariana, ever the devoted friend, urged Elena to take some time off, maybe a vacation. "You deserve a break from Fairview," she would say, "even just for a week." Elena appreciated the concern, but felt compelled to stay. She wasn't ready to leave behind the people who looked up to her. Instead, she balanced her time between working with social services, advocating for police reform, and nurturing her own healing process. As for Richard Patterson, he quietly returned to Langley, continuing his duties as CIA director. Before leaving, he and Elena had one last conversation over coffee at the same diner where he'd first met David Sullivan. Patterson commended Elena for her bravery and promised that if she ever needed anything, she had his direct line. Elena smiled, promising to stay in touch. She understood now that even in the darkest corridors of power, allies could be found. The final loose end tied up when Elena and Ramirez met with Laura Mendez and her team. They confirmed that Morgan would face federal trial for his numerous charges. The DOJ was also reviewing other dismissed cases to see if there had been a pattern of wrongful arrests. Mendez hinted that Elena might be asked to testify on behalf of those who'd been similarly framed. Elena agreed, determined to see that no one else's life would be turned upside down like hers. And so, Elena Davies moved forward, not just as a social worker, but as a beacon of justice in Fairview. People no longer saw her merely as Miss Elena, the helpful neighbor. She had become a symbol of courage and perseverance. From whispered rumors of that girl who got off easy to widespread acknowledgement that she was framed and she fought back, Elena's story evolved into a rallying cry for systemic change. Late one evening, Elena returned to her small painting hobby, blending watercolors into a swirl of vibrant blues and yellows. The design represented hope rising against a dark backdrop of injustice. With each gentle brushstroke, she felt a sense of catharsis, a quiet assurance that her experience, painful as it was, had meaning. And maybe, just maybe, the city of Fairview, once haunted by racial tension and corrupt policing, would start to heal as well. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of Elena Davies, an inspiring fighter for truth who refused to bow to injustice. Her story is a reminder that even in the face of corruption, a single voice can unite a community, expose hidden truths, and catalyze systemic change. From the dark confines of a holding cell to the triumphant light of vindication, Elena's resolve carried her through every obstacle. And it wasn't just her fight alone. Friends, family, and unexpected allies made all the difference. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or rekindled your hope in justice, please show your support. Like this video, share it with anyone who needs to believe in the power of truth. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and perseverance. Let's keep the conversation about reform and equality alive. Together, we can help shape a fairer world for all.